everyone, and welcome to the fourth quarter review meeting for the Fairfield Board of Finance. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? And since Mr. Brockfeld is outgunned from this side of the table tonight, and we don't want him to feel lonely, we're going to ask
you think 1 against 4 is out.
we're going to ask you to do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Maybe outgunned is the wrong word. Maybe outmanned.
Yeah, right.
And womaned is the right word. All right. The agenda tonight for our quarterly review meeting is to review the current status of the town's pension funds, to review the current status of the fiscal year 2012 budgeted items as of June 30th, 2012, for both the Board of Ed and the town. Please note that we know that the 2012 actual results are not finalized. These are preliminary numbers at this time. The third item is to hear a presentation on the GASB 67 and 68 pronouncements regarding pension accounting and funding impact. That is actually an informational exercise at this point. And to hear and report an update from the private agency subcommittee. That is not a subcommittee as labeled on the charge here of the Board of Finance. It's actually a townwide subcommittee that we have members. Mr. DeWitt chairs that. And then to hear an update from the Building Project Process Review Committee, that would be from Mr. Brown, who'll give us a brief status update on that. That's the state of play for tonight. But before we delve directly into the agenda, a few announcements. Number one, Mr. Stone and Mr. Bolito send their regrets. They had previously planned vacations, and they are both out of town and will not be joining us tonight. Secondly, Mr. Walsh, our newest member, and we will welcome him when he comes, got lost on the way here. No, I'm kidding. He had a conflict, an unavoidable conflict early in the meeting, and he will be here as soon as feasible. And we'll welcome him to the board. Number three, Mr. Kiley, I had actually specifically requested if he could be here this evening to recognize his 15 years of service on this board as both a friend, mentor, and colleague of all of ours. Mr. Kiley could not be here tonight because of a business obligation, but he assures me he will be here for the September meeting, at which point we will duly recognize and perhaps roast him. The last item is a new item. Mrs. Elaine Gaffney has submitted her resignation as a member of the Board of Finance. Mr. Tetra received that just yesterday and forwarded it to me. So we'll go back to the process of the Board of Selectmen appointing a member to the Board of Finance. That member will be a Democrat, as Mrs. Gaffney was a Democrat. So we will miss her on this board. We only had her for a short time. I really enjoyed getting to know her. She was very dedicated, smart woman, very nice, and we appreciate her efforts during the budget season and all the work she put in, and I am sure she is disappointed in having to resign her position. So I think I speak for my colleagues when we wish her well and thank her for her service. The last item, before I go right to the main agenda, regards Mr. Hiller. Now, there's been some press reports, and we've received some phone calls related to Mr. Hiller, who not only serves as the Chief Fiscal Officer for the town, but also serves as the clerk of our board. And two actually independent positions. The clerk of our board is appointed by the Board of Finance. And Mr. Hiller was appointed clerk of this board well before. He predates me on this board, and Mrs. LeClaire, I think his appointment predates your service on the board as the longest-serving member. And in fact, I believe he's been in that position for 13 years, and prior to that, he was a member of this board for 18 years. So we've heard some press reports, read some press reports, and I wanted, since we are the Board of Finance and work extensively with Mr. Hiller, I wanted to give Mr. Tetra the opportunity to address what we've been reading. Feel free, sir, if you wouldn't mind coming forward. It is. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Tetra.
Push this back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Simply stated, it's a personnel matter at this point, and we won't be making any comment.
Okay. And we're not privy, this board isn't privy to those conversations on these personnel matters.
Correct.
Okay, and we weren't consulted on the item. This was something that was happened within the administration at this point.
Correct.
Right, and your understanding is the same as mine regarding the clerk position for the board.
Correct.
Okay, and I believe that's we don't have the town attorney here, but I believe that's a charter stipulation, isn't it?
I believe that's where I read about it,
Yeah.
and I believe it goes back a few years, and I believe you and I have had a couple conversations on that.
Yeah.
But that position is appointed by the Board of Finance.
Right. I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page, because there was some questions that I did receive from that. Can I ask, Mr. Tetra, when you are able to provide additional information, if you would please reach out to us and provide that information as quickly as possible? And if that means that there's a need for a meeting or what have you, please just let us know, and we'll try to accommodate that, as we have in the past.
Whatever's appropriate, we'll be glad to do.
Okay. While I have Mr. Tetra here, are there any questions from board members, just so we can move forward? Mr. DeWitt?
Real quick question about our clerk. Is there any town charter restrictions or obligations to having a clerk or not having a clerk? In other words, if this isn't resolved within a month, is there some
Yeah.
charter violation by us not having a clerk?
I haven't read the charter in quite a while, so I would suggest reviewing that before taking this. There are some qualifications for the clerk, I believe. And again, off the top of my head, I can't list those, but I think they were spelled out pretty clearly. I don't remember whether it was a you have to have. I think it was, it's something that is helpful to the Board of Finance, certainly as we move through. In the short term, we will cover those responsibilities.
Yeah, that's fair, because as I think
My
you just
personal
said-
opinion is we need it.
No, I'm with you, and
Yeah.
the only reason I ask is because you had mentioned that it's a Board of Finance elected or appointed position.
Appointed position.
So that would mean we would have to, do this at our next meeting, or do we have to do it at our next meeting is kind of.
It is entirely up to us, and as of right now, and I want to be clear, Mr. Hiller is the
He's
clerk
still
of
our
this
clerk.
board.
Got it. Great. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Brown?
Just a question on time frame. Any idea when you may be able to get back to us?
No comment at this time, Mr. Brown.
Okay.
Mr. Brockfield, anything? Nope. All right. Thank you, Mr. Tetra. We appreciate it. You might as well stay there or grab your materials. Yeah. All right. As has become custom, the first item on the agenda for the quarterly review is to review the current status of the town's pension funds. We did receive a package with all the materials. I do have hard copy if people in the audience or board members need hard copies. We do have additional hard copies. Thank you, Mrs. Gardner, for providing those. We have two reports from Callan, which is one of our pension advisors, or the pension advisor, correct? And we have a report on the pension and a report on other post-employment benefits, both of those items. So tonight, Mr. Tetro is going to represent the pension boards. You'll recall in the past, we've had Mr. Vahey here and a couple of others.
And Chairman Malarkey at times.
Yeah.
The vacation bug has taken hold in
There you go.
town.
All right, so thank you, and thank you again, Mr. Tetro.
All right, to kick things off, I went back to the ordinance just to make sure that as the reporting to the Board of Finance on a quarterly basis is something we've kicked in relatively recently. There's an ordinance passed a couple of years ago that defined this as a responsibility of the pension board to get back to the Board of Finance. And that ordinance, as it reads, is the investment board shall submit to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance a quarterly statement of fund performance. The statement shall disclose the balances of the funds and rates of return for the quarter presented. For those two items, the reports from Callan, which are termed the flash reports that we receive every month from our investment advisors, address those two issues in terms of the year-to-date performance, in this case, as well as the quarterly performance, and the balances in each fund. In addition, in reviewing this, it came to light that item 3 in this is to report on the increase or decrease in the fund balances compared to the prior quarter. If you review those reports, you'll find that's not there. So we have put together two other reports this afternoon. Again, I apologize for this not being there sooner, but in closer reading of this ordinance, I find that we haven't been reporting this on a regular basis, so this report was prepared this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you.
That one down. That's report number 1. This is report number 2. Get down here, I'll pick them up and leave them available for the audience.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra.
So again, as much as we have been reporting on the quarterly updates, we haven't done that quarter-to-quarter comparison as defined by the RTM in the ordinance. You can look at this and over time decide if you feel this report is helpful and if you wish to see this continue.
Wow.
Anyone in the audience? We produced the same report showing the quarter-to-quarter numbers for both the pension funds as well as for the OPEB trust funds. Now, the last item that we're asked to report on each quarter is a description of the investments maintained and compliance with the investment board's determined mix policy. So to help with that, what I'd like to do is turn to the first Callan flash report concerning the pension funds. And looking on page 1, you can see the about the fourth column in is labeled target. That has been a discussion point with this board over time, and I just wanted to step through the progress. As you look at this report, you'll see that we have overweights in domestic equity at about 34% versus a 25% target, and fixed income at a 34% versus about a 30% target. We're in the process of moving funds. As we've spent pretty much the last year interviewing different fund managers, identifying them, and starting to move money over. We have 3, what I'm going to call them, moves in place at the moment, or in process at the moment, that have not been completed, so that still accounts for the overweight position. But just to clarify, in private equity, we've selected Mesero Private Equity Fund for this allocation, and we'll be moving monies to achieve the 5% target there. In hedge funds, the board has recently selected DGAM hedge funds.
Sorry, Mike, what was that?
DGAM, D-G-A-M, hedge funds. It's a fund of funds. And we'll be moving, filling out the remaining 5% of that to bring that to a 10% allocation. And in commodities, which is not really spelled out on this, it's going to be listed under other. We've got a 3% target that will be moving, we've selected Gresham as our commodities manager for that number. So when those moves are complete, we'll be a lot closer to the targets in each of the areas. Sorry.
What is good is, I think, as compared to prior quarters, we're only seeing, within individual fund managers, we're only seeing 3 instances where it's over 10% with those fund managers. And 2 of those instances are domestic fixed. And there's only one that's 10.2%, the Boston company, in the domestic equity. So is the goal there to get those as well below that 10% threshold?
We'll be looking at those too. Obviously, there's certain issues in terms of, we could look at these every day and things go
Right,
up and down.
exactly.
And so the first goal is, from a macro standpoint, to get us in the right categories properly.
Yeah.
Then to look at managing within that. We've got certain guidelines, and I think we talked about this example at a prior meeting where we had an investment in Apple stock, and because earlier in the year Apple was going through the roof, we actually had to kind of confirm with our manager that we really meant the 5% cap of that we had there, and so when it got over that, we expected them to take action, if so on a daily basis, to stay within that.
Yeah, well, the 10.2 doesn't quote-unquote concern me as much as the one that sticks out is the 19 and the 15.5. But again, the 19 and the
areas-
15.5 are in the fixed, so,
And I believe those are areas we need to move the money out of to,
yeah. Yeah, they are, most definitely. Mr. Brockville, any questions?
Sure. You done for now?
Yeah, please.
I guess one question, Mike, Mr. Tetro, is, Mr. Flynn and I had a conversation about this afternoon. I might actually turn it back to you to explain it better than I did. The way I read this, and from my background, is to look at that these are investment returns of the managers aggregated, obviously, in the total fund, right? So if I go to a couple pages forward, I see that for the...
Page 3, right?
Page 3, I see that for the fiscal year, we returned less than 1%, about 0.6% on the total fund. I mean, that's how I read it, because that's the return of the different managers, the so-called investment return. Mr. Flynn had a question as to whether or not that was accurate, and I'm going to actually flip it back to him for a second.
Yeah, I just recalled prior quarters when we reviewed this report, because obviously, the return on investment, what we're looking at is, this would quote that it's under a 1% return on investment for the year, versus in the actuarial reports, granted there's smoothing there, but the actuarial reports, we're looking at a 7.75% return on investment, okay? But I seem to recall, in prior discussions of this specific report, that this was not an actual rate of return report, but rather was what you would argue it was a differential in balance report. In other words, it took into account divestitures, all right, distributions, and inflows. So that the question is this an apples-to-apples comparison between a true rate of return, which would be looking around the 7.75, versus what I would review as maybe an activities report? Now, I hope that it is the activity versus the rate of return, and that we don't have a 7% plus differential here.
Right.
But even if that is the case, we've still got what you and I believe is a significant differential between that 7.75 and the rate of return for the year.
And for what it's worth, just to come back to me,
Yeah, please.
and we went back and forth on this a little bit this afternoon. I actually think this is one of the rare cases where Mr. Flynn may not be correct.
And I could be wrong.
He's almost always right when it comes to accounting stuff, so I defer. But I'm looking also at Mr. Mayor, because he's an expert in this kind of stuff as well.
Yeah.
I read it pretty clearly as these are the investment returns. And I've attended a lot of the pension board
Yep.
meetings separately, and I think we actually even discussed this at one point. Mr. Caliper was involved in the conversation. And
I just remember this exact same question coming up every time we look at this page.
Right.
And I remember there being an answer that indicated that it was not apples to apples. And I think that's I hope I'm misremembering.
Well, we might not be able to answer it right this moment, because I see Mr. Tetro doesn't look like he has a...
yeah,
Yeah.
given the significance of the question,
I mean,
let me confirm the apples to apples or apples to oranges
Yeah.
status of this, so that we answer it once and for all, so we're clear on what it is going forward.
right.
Yeah.
So let me ask a different, can I continue?
Hey,
Yeah.
please.
So let me ask a different question
Anybody else,
of Mr. Tetro, and as even though you're first selectman, you're only a representative from the pension board, one vote. On one hand, if, for the time being, my interpretation's correct, the so-called good news as an investor is that we basically track the benchmarks, in other words, of all the different categories. You know, you have the equities and the fixed income and so forth, and when you blend it all together, Callan is saying that 0.66 would be the benchmark, so we did 0.62. So give or take, we tracked the index, the market, or the different markets. So that's good in a sense. Obviously, it's not good in an absolute sense. It's only good in a relative sense. So I guess the question is, and most of this predates you, right? But I think we confirmed from Liz Cherney that we've returned 3.9% annually over the last 10 years. And if this is actually .62, that would bring that down by about, well, not much, down to, say, 3.9 or 3.8 or whatever it may be. So obviously, it's a concern on some level that we're forecasting almost 8% and in a sense, budgeting that way, and we're returning much less. So it's good to some extent that we've tracked the indexes, but it's bad that we've set up a portfolio that leads us to that index and therefore leads us to getting this return. So I guess the question is, has there been any discussion in the pension board about the quality of this portfolio allocation in order to obviously try to get better returns?
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing discussion. That's been the focal point of every single meeting this year as we've gone out and picked different managers for different areas. I mean, your point's well taken on this year. If you go back and look at the last 36 months, you can see it's 9.95%.
Right.
We're looking at making decisions on a 30-year time frame here, so any one year, while significant, doesn't change what the objectives are and what we're going, as you well know.
Right.
That because you have a bad day in the market, you don't sell off and try and buy something else to have a good day tomorrow. But yes, that's absolutely the ongoing discussion, and we'll continue to monitor that. And that is the role and function of the pension board, to do the best they can from that standpoint.
Okay. One other question, it's just a plumbing question, so to speak. And I hope my memory is correct. If you go back to the fixed income, domestic fixed income category, one is we've expressed concern about the over 10%. You've acknowledged that that's being looked at. GSAM, which I assume is Goldman Sachs Asset Management, is now 15% of the fund. And if my memory serves me correct from my pension board days, we used to have somebody called Dwight Asset Management. And so this is a big change. It looks like you zeroed out Dwight and added GSAM. That's what it looks like to me. And it is a big number, $45 million. So I'm curious if you could just comment
I
on
believe
that,
there have been some acquisitions taking place in that regard.
where Dwight may have been bought by Goldman Sachs. Okay. So I guess what would lead the next question would be then, has there been active discussion about whether or not the new management of this new owner in any way changes our opinion on, because it's a big chunk, $45 million.
That's an ongoing discussion.
Okay. Okay.
Anyone else?
Thanks.
Mr. Brown? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
pitch
I'm
on.
finished.
We've spent in the past, somewhat significant amount of time talking about smoothing with the actuaries and amongst ourselves. So we see that this fiscal year is less than 1%, and we said we're not too worried, well, because of smoothing. And then we see 36.
I don't believe anybody said we're not too worried. At least,
Well-
I certainly didn't mean to say that.
Okay.
I meant to say that when you're looking at investment horizons of 20 and 30 years, you don't want to overreact in the short term to this, but.
I agree.
And in this past year, we've literally spent every month, as we've talked through different fund managers, in terms of what their individual targets are and how much money we're investing in them.
Okay. When I say, and I'll rephrase it, when we talk about smoothing, we talk about you can't just look at 1 year or one setup in time, okay? And on this return, we have 36 months, and it shows 9.95% return. The question I have is, can we take a look, when we get these reports, can we look at a longer time frame, at least 5 years, and take a look how we're doing over the past 5 years or even 10? Because as you said, the actuaries, they really look at this over what, 20 years,
30.
30 years? Possibly. Okay.
Do we have the total here? Last 5 years.
This is
Okay, then.
felt like we went to the ocean there for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, last 5 years.
So if you turn it over to page 2 of the handout. Thank you, Mr. Tetra. So the last 5 years were essentially flat. At zero.
There's no roll, oh, there was there.
I see, was that 1.88, or is that the benchmark? So
That's the
we're at
benchmark.
.06, okay.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Okay, so even over the past 5 years, we're quite a distance from our goal. And I'm sure you guys are talking about that on the pension board every time you meet.
There have been a number of significant occurrences in the last 5 years that certainly have impacted that.
No doubt.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the challenge that every pension board has. Certainly ours is no different in doing that. And once we kind of have allocated our monies out, and again, we have spent a significant amount of time in the past 12 months targeting folks, kind of having broad-based discussions on the different classes in terms of what we're putting in there, interviewing different fund managers. The hedge fund manager, we spent almost 4.5 hours interviewing 3 different fund managers at our last meeting. Once we get over that hump, then that'll be the primary focus where we're going, and so absolutely. But that's a concern going forward, and we've made adjustments in the discount rate in the past 6 months based on that. We've got another one coming next year, and if we are not hitting these targets, we'll have to fully review what we're doing with discount rates going forward from that point.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Brown, any follow-up on that? Mr. DeWitt?
Just a note from the slowest one up here. I'm surprised to see the last 3 years at 9.95. It seems like an awful high number for the last 3 years, and then 5 years is basically flat.
Last year was
The-
big.
It's basically 1 year, right?
Last
I was
year.
going to
You
say, it's
basic-
not really, it's,
If you think of the last 5 years as basically, we started at the top, the market crashed, we came back. So if you look at the last 3 years, you're going from the valley up, so
Right.
you're going to get a little bit higher return based on that.
so it's really a
Go back
1 year
5 years.
windfall, kind of,
Yeah.
over the
Well,
last 3, right?
The last 3 years has been the windfall. If you look at the last 2, I think that's where you saw the higher returns than normal.
Yeah, not this year. It was actually the couple of years before.
I'm sorry, years,
Yeah.
if this is year 1, years 2 and 3, going back.
And there was a lot more money. It seems like all the highest percentages were in S&P and S&P, the hedge funds and the Russell 3000, so.
I-
Right.
Yep.
He seems like and alternative investments is what we really took the hit in the last 5 years, which kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah, that's why the board has
Yeah.
spent so much time in the past 12 months focused on the policy, the allocation, who we're investing with, what the type of reporting is, how to make sure that reporting is as transparent as possible, including providing information to this board that you haven't seen previously, and going back to, going back to the ordinance to make sure we're providing all the information that we've been asked to this board.
Yeah. Sure. Are you all set?
Yeah,
Mr. Brockville?
Thanks. Mr. Tetra, just going back for one question, I think it's something that's come up in the past. The OPEB money, right? We're on a ramp to, in fact, I don't know, we may even be at fully funding, I don't remember now.
Fiscal year 13 will be the first year that we'll fully
Fully
funding our
Right.
annual required
Right,
contribution.
so we're doing all that well, and obviously the amount of money in there is much smaller than the big pension fund as of now. I guess the question is, who is the pension board, I think I know the answer to the first question, is the pension board responsible for the management of the OPEB money? I think the answer is yes. The second question is the allocation, could you tell us a little bit about the allocation of the investments in the OPEB money, which we don't have any detail on?
Yeah, there is no detail on it. That's, what you see is what you get from that standpoint. That will be the, kind of the next target for the board,
Okay.
to identify allocation targets, how we set it up, and how we, kind of, as that fund grows, how we manage those allocations.
So right now,
Time frame for that, yeah. What's a time frame for that? Do you have?
I'm going to tell you that's next on the priority list, so in the next 6 months, we should be addressing that, perhaps as soon as the next 2 months, but
Thank you, Chris.
So I guess twofold question, and you've given a part answer, you're working on it, and that's fine. One is, so can I take it that the money's in a, like, treasuries or a money market fund at this point?
It's listed there, I believe.
So I don't, unless I'm not reading it, I don't
Might
see
be
it.
on the,
Smith Affiliated Capital,
yeah.
Okay.
fixed income,
Okay, so it's, right now it's in fixed income.
and you can see the breakout between fire and police and employee.
Right. Okay. So that'll be something, maybe at the next quarterly, we can get a little more information on. Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions from board members? All right, I want to come back then to me on this topic. Let's, first of all, I want to thank the pension board. I think within the last couple of years, the communication between the pension board and this board has been much improved. I think that started under the prior administration and certainly continued under your administration and involvement. And it's also great that they put together their own investment policy or updated their investment policy, and then I think, if memory serves, each quarter, we see them getting closer to, as you referred to them, their targets. So that's all good news. Obviously, the returns for this given year, whether this report is done the way we think it is or done another way, is we're tracking where the market was, right, where our investments were. Also good news. My biggest concern is that, as I recall looking at the actuarial analysis done for us just several months ago when we approved the budget, there was what I would refer to as a funding mountain between this fiscal year, 2013, and what the next year's projections were per that actuarial report. And the number that sticks in my mind was $4 to $4.5 million increase year over year from what 2013's projection would be to what, all things being equal, all calculations being equal, all assumptions being equal, what the funding requirement would be for 2014. Does everyone remember that? So my question is this. Now we've got the full year under our belt, and granted, there's smoothing and everything that goes on. We had a 7 3/4% smoothed 30-year actuarial return on investment. If this number holds, and we got less than a 1% return, obviously that $4 million would be impacted by that. Do we know at this point, and it might be too early, the significance of that impact? And if we don't know now, when can we know so that we can be prepared?
Good question from a standpoint that, understanding what you're getting is the flash report. These were
Right.
given to the pension board a week ago, last Tuesday night.
Right.
So since then, no, we haven't gotten back to our actuary to see what that is. But I can follow up certainly and see what the impact. In January, we get the full analysis. Either way, we can see if we can get an update on it between now and then.
Right. I just know that this is going to be a point of huge consternation. I thought it was going to be a point of concern at the 4 to 4.5 million mark in growth. That's just growth. I think it's going to be a huge point of concern, everything else being equal, with that type of return. The one thing's for certain, that's not bringing the number down.
Right, we don't know the magnitude, but.
Right. You know, so I would even say that if we could get it before January, that's going to help you guys with your budget process in the fall. And we also have the capital planning summit coming up. And I think if we're going to be looking at large dollars like this, we're going to want to know a little bit more. That's the way I'd look at it. Does anybody disagree? I'm sure you don't. I mean,
Yep. Yeah, I think your point's well taken, and we'll do our best to get that information in as short a timeframe as possible.
any other questions on this item? And Mr. Brockfeld did go through OPEB as well. Does anybody have any questions on that? Ken? All right. Mr. Tetra, thank you. All right. Item number 2 on our agenda is to review the current status of the fiscal year 2012 actuals, preliminary actuals, as compared to the 2012 budget. I'm going to request that we do the Board of Ed first, because we do have senior representatives of the administration and the Board of Education here to speak to their budgeted versus actual results for the year. So, Dr. Tidal, if you and Ms. Iacona would come on up. And by the way, thank you very much for your preparation of the reports that you guys provide us on a quarterly basis. We appreciate it. Welcome.
Hi.
Hey, Dorian.
So, I don't know if you want a sort of a quick overview of the
Please.
report that you received. So the first report that Doreen did is an update of the report the Board of Ed got in June, at which point we needed to request that the board transfer funds under the board's policy and the
Which-
state statute.
I'm sorry, Dr. Tidal, what are you referring to as the
Referring
first
to the one that
report?
says 2011-12 budget transfers and updated balances as of July,
Okay, so the colored one.
colored one,
Okay,
that.
thank you.
And that's, what's different about that from what the board got is that Doreen updated that based on months more of activity. The board got it in June, at the, June 25th or so, and this is updated through the 17th of July. It doesn't change a whole lot. There, we had projected a balance on June 26th of approximately $345,000 to be returned to the town, and the updated number, which is the next column over, is $347,933. Pretty much in line with where Doreen had projected. There's some ins and outs that happened in that month that are there. I guess the big picture on this, and some of this had come up in our budget discussion, was that we had some, I would say, 2 to 2.5 very large favorable occurrences that happened with our expenses, that happened really after the budget was approved, after even July 1st, that led to significant balances in some accounts, and then we had some unexpected emergencies, I guess that's redundant, emergencies, that required we expend funds. But the net was still to the good, and these had come up, I think one came up with this board and one came up at the RTM. The two biggest pieces to this, the one that came up here had to do with electricity, with the significant change in the rates of the electricity that went into effect January 1st, I believe, right, Doreen?
Yep.
So we get a half a year's worth of savings, and then we built in the new rate into the current year. So you remember the budget showed a negative.
How much, what was the total amount of that, the gross amount of the savings on the electricity?
For this year?
About 573.
Okay. So you had 573,000 due to the negotiation of better rates.
Right.
Okay.
And then the,
And the total that you're returning is the 347?
correct.
Okay.
And then we also had, and this came up at the RTM level, we also had some unanticipated retirements, some of which occurred actually in July. An extra 10 to 12 retirements at an average savings of $35,000 per retirement. So right there, you get another chunk of money.
What was the total in this? I know it's in the detail, but I wanted,
The additional retirees,
yeah.
434.
Yep.
Yeah. Which is over there in that left column.
Yep.
Under personnel services. Now, there's some, there's some other big numbers in that column, but basically, that's where you really netted out the savings. Now, depending on the year, Some years you need to hire additional people that you didn't anticipate because of enrollment and this sort of thing. But this year, we were almost right on the number in terms of what we said the FTEs would be and what we ended up hiring for FTEs. So we did not need to, we didn't get a sudden, we did get a surge in our kindergarten enrollment, but it was offset elsewhere. So the net of everything was, we were pretty much right on the FTE number. So we didn't have to dip into that, as has had to happen in the past. So those are really the two biggest points. I mean, there were some others. Certainly the mild winter helped. Certainly the lack of, so it helped in the heating area, and it also helps in the overtime area, because of not having to clean up. Now, that was offset in part by the hurricane and the blizzard. Okay, it wasn't all peaches and cream, right? But certainly, you know, as of November 1, after we had just finished cleaning up from a blizzard and a hurricane, it didn't look like this was going to happen. And so that at least helped a little bit there. So that produced some savings. And then there's, there were a large number of additional projects that came our way during the year to you know, that ate into that number. There's lots of other ins and outs, but these are the big items. I mean, you heard about some of them, and that was, you know, the boiler at Ward High School. We had to sink significant money into the McKinley roof to take care of that problem. Right, oh yeah, we had to do some flashing at Ludlow Middle School. You know, we had a number of those kinds of things that you know, quote unquote, hurt us, except that, you know, in the case of the McKinley roof, we were actually able to take care of that problem, and we're fixing it now. So that was sitting out there as a funding request that was about to hurtle your way, and it won't be coming. We also took care of the, if you recall, you were also sitting on a funding request. At one point, it was out from the TFC at close to $200,000 for additional testing of the Ludlow windows. That was, then the first selectman sort of turned that back to us because we thought it was going to be that, and we've taken care of that. So that request is no longer coming your way as well. Now, the funding for the windows is still coming, and, you know, the project is still alive, but those, I'll call smaller requests, we were able to take care of, and, you know, a number of other issues that came up that were unanticipated. So that's sort of the big picture on the whole thing, and the quarterly report that follows it is the standard quarterly report that you've seen. It gives more detail.
Do we have any questions from board members? Mrs. Leclerc?
I just wanted to ask about, there's a line under personnel services substitutes, why that number was so high this year.
That's a good question. It's the same one the board.
Oh, yeah, I was smiling.
The board asked that, and fortunately, Margaret Mary hadn't retired at that point. And basically, what happens is, during the course of a year, you'll see that there's a number 2 lines above that, 519, to the good. Basically, if somebody exits the system, you know, leaves the system, or we had a couple retirements in the middle of the year, and we filled the position with a substitute for the rest of the year. We saved the money on the salary, but we overexpend on the substitute. And so, of course, the net of this is usually to the good. This is also, I should point out, the first year that we took substitutes out of the hands of the principals and put them centrally, and so budgeting this substitute number was a bit of a guess. But basically, the way the system's always accounted for it is if anybody leaves in the middle of the year, and what we do is hire a sub for the rest of the year, that gets charged to the sub account. And so that's why that number gets to be so big, but then again, that certified salary number, certified salary savings is significant. So it's not quite a wash, but that's the ins and outs of that. Is that about it, Doreen? Yeah. We do count on some turnover in certified salaries every year. That's built into our budget. This is in excess of that.
Mrs. Leclerc, you good? Any other questions? Mr. Brockville?
Just a good question. Well, a question about good news. I
We'll
should
be
say.
the judge of
That's
that.
right, that's why I corrected it, a question about good news. I'm just curious, our electric bill, so to speak, or our budget, what's our total expenditure or budget on electricity?
Yep.
Round number is good
She'll
enough.
look it up.
Yeah. I'm
Just
just,
business managers don't like to guess.
Doreen doesn't do round
Right.
numbers.
Don't like that.
Right.
You know, so I'll do the big picture, she'll do the details, kind of how we.
only the bond traders
She'll
do the
straighten you
guessing.
out, is
She'll
what you're
straighten me
saying.
out, exactly. That's why I keep looking over here.
Right.
Right.
Do you mind another question while she searches?
I have no other
Okay,
questions. I'm sorry.
all right.
I could ask you how many home runs Roger Maris hit.
I do have a couple, if I might, while Doreen searches for the answer here.
Got it.
You have it? Or,
No, go ahead.
okay, I can filibuster. You talked about retirees for this coming year and saved a lot on that. How many, off the top of your head, how many retirements did you have versus a standard year? I'm trying to get a gauge on whether, are we chronically under budgeting retirees, or was this an anomaly?
I asked Margaret Mary that because there were a couple years she said they got caught short.
Right,
I think, I mean, I wasn't here then, but this happened in a lot of places where when the economy tanked, nobody retired, and you get stuck, because what happens is, you know, you get to July 1st, and we budget for, let's say, 10 or 12.
Right.
It's kind of been the number. And some years I've had like 6. Now you're on the hook for the difference because nobody comes back. So I think, you know, we may need to look at this when we do our budget for next year and say, look at a 5-year average.
Well, let's-
You know, and budget that, because, you know, the number of people that are eligible to retire is a lot larger than the number of people that actually retire.
okay, so let me ask it this way then, because I want to be more specific on it.
Sure.
For fiscal year 2012, that resulted in this 434
Right.
saving, how many people retired?
20, I think by the end of the day, it was like 22.
Okay. How many did we budget to retire for fiscal 13?
12.
How many have
That's the way
retired?
we did 12, plus we
Plus we
did 2
added
more.
2.
So it's
14.
14 now.
How many have retired now, that we know? We're in July now.
I don't know off the top of my head. I can get it to you. I just,
Yeah. And do you,
higher than that.
it's higher than 14?
Higher than 14.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
I don't
So-
want to put a number out there and then
Right. No, if
personnel
you
in the
could,
morning will say, what are you talking about?
yeah,
Right?
yeah. If you could find that out for us,
Yeah,
that'd
we
be
can get
great.
that to you.
Because I'm trying to figure out whether this is a one-time thing or we're chronically under budgeting. Because
Right.
the way, putting it in global terms, what I'm hearing from you is that with the 573, which was the energy savings, was a one-time kind of windfall,
Right.
right? There was the savings in retiree that comes out to like 430, 434. Good round number is essentially you had 2 good guys of $1 million.
Right.
Right? One of them was arguably a one-time good guy, which is the 573.
Right.
The retiree, a little bit more nebulous for me,
Right.
whether that's one-time or a budgeting issue, right? And then you have what I would refer as $650,000 of essentially one-time bad guys, right? That went in the bad camp. So you went from $1 million of good guys, 650 of bad guys, to $350,000,
Pretty much it.
right, which brings you less than 1% within what your budget was. But if you didn't have that energy issue come up, you would have been coming back to us for more money, whether it be in the form of bonding. Well, I'm just saying,
Necessarily.
right, okay.
Right. I mean, we would have had to take steps to cover the shortfall. Right? And that's why being conservative on your retirees is not necessarily a bad strategy, because we don't carry any reserve funds for unanticipated emergencies. We just have to deal with them. And
Right.
so,
And that's
you gotta
kind of
have
what.
some good fortune.
And that's what I'm trying to get to, is I want to know, you know, I'm trying to get to the point of how lucky were we, how good were we, what's the combination? Because this could argue, one could argue that we over budgeted, for the Board of Education last year. Right?
You could argue that. I
Okay.
wouldn't argue that, just for all the reasons that you just stated.
And that's what I'm trying to get to, right?
I mean, that would not be a good thing. And I think the lesson here is, we got lucky, and we got lucky in a good way, and we took the money that was here and we're giving it back to the town. I do want people to understand that.
Yeah.
Because as you know, by law, once the money comes to the Board of Ed, it's the Board of Ed's money. We could have taken the $345,000 and sunk it into some other educational program. We didn't. We recognized the savings that the town essentially got us on
Right.
electricity, and knew that the right thing to do was to give it back to the town.
I think Doreen has her number for you.
The estimated cost, or the final costs were 2.4 million. The budget's around 3 million.
Right. So, it's to be congratulated that the town.
Absolutely.
I actually don't personally know who, the town or the Board of Ed or whoever.
Twig, right?
Twig did a phenomenal job and saved us about 15-20% on our
Yep.
electricity bill. But the flip side is, I'm going to be a little less sugar-coated than Tom is being very polite, is that actually I don't see this as being such a wonderful report that we're getting here. This almost is like Apple today reported some big profit, but it disappointed the market, and the stock's down like 50 points. You guys actually are a couple $100,000 to the bad if you don't have this fluke that had nothing to do with you guys.
Well, then we would have had to manage to that figure. I mean, it's not the case that we would have then
Right.
come in the negative with this. We would have not expended some things. We would have held the spending back in areas where we could do that and not impact our programs, and we would have got to the end of the year in the black. We were required to do that. So I don't want you thinking that, had this not happened, that we would have come back to you and said, our allocation was insufficient for the year, you need to appropriate an additional $200,000 to cover the issue. So we would have.
No,
managed
but some of those items that you did manage, like the McKinley roof and some of the other items, might not have been managed in this manner. As you said, they were on the track to come back through the approval process,
Right.
and that might have had to have happened.
Yeah, I probably would have prioritized McKinley because of the urgency of the issue there. It isn't that we just come back to you. It's
I understand.
got to go through the whole procedure.
Right.
And so while that's all going on, the roof keeps leaking. So if there's any way to do that out of the current year, operating budget, we really thought that was in the best interest of the town and the families there. So we're just, if we can do it, we can. I mean, if the number's too big, you're right. We got to come back and say, look, we can't handle this kind of figure in our budget.
Right.
Just follow up one thing.
Please.
Again, I think it's to be congratulated how much we saved on electricity. Is that a multi-year deal of some sort? Does that follow on for the next couple of years?
The electricity deal does.
Yeah, I'm not, December
13.
13 or 14, I don't remember.
I don't know. I have to ask.
I think Mr. Tetro
Maybe they know.
has,
I think if you go back and look at on the budget drivers that we put together on the town side, you'll see that electricity costs were down for fiscal 13 of what we had this year. So yes, it's multiple years, but as Dr. Tittle pointed out, the cost savings for next year in electricity is already baked into the budget,
no,
hardwired, if you will.
Right.
We don't know
got it.
when.
I got it. You don't have to be an engineer to know hardwire.
Okay.
It's better pricing, but we don't expect to see another $500,000.
No, I'm not, I was just wondering if we could feel, right,
And that's why I referred to it as one time.
right.
Yeah.
What's, any other questions on that? I do want to acknowledge, Ms. Iacono, you did said something that was very true, which is that, quote-unquote, statutorily, you weren't required to give the money back. The fact that you did, please extend our appreciation to your colleagues for playing nicely in the sandbox with everybody else and dealing with the financial thing. What I just want to be mindful of is how much on the fringes we play, right? And how good thing, bad thing, and we're going to see this a little bit on the town side, If we didn't get lucky with the winter this year, it could have been a whole different ballgame in some of the other items. And I'm always cognizant of that when I'm looking at these things.
I do want to point out one other thing that helped us. We budgeted for special ed appropriately in 11-12. As you recall, that was a number that we had brought to you as going up quite a bit because we had historically overexpended special ed. And this past year, special ed ran actually a slight surplus. So special ed is a big wild card, and talk about variability. But the fact that we budgeted for it accurately meant we didn't have to play games around, using some of the surplus to spend special ed. So special ed did a good job this year, I want to point that out. And I rarely say that because it rarely happens in my experience to have special ed actually manage their budget into the black. That's don't expect to hear that too many years from me.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions, comments from board members? Seeing none, thank you very much, everybody.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
All right, with that done, we'll turn to the town side. The town side, we were nice enough to get a kind of a roll-forward schedule that talks about a surplus. Can we put that to the side for a second? My colleagues agree? And go.
The Word?
Yeah.
Word, yeah.
And then we have the Word document, the budget monitoring report that Linda Gardner puts together along with the documents. Good evening, and thank you for being here. Thanks for the effort putting together the report.
No problem.
So, is everyone amenable to the team just walking us down the document first, which lays out the various ups and downs here, and then we can go back and ask specific questions? Is that good with everybody?
That's good.
Okay, so why don't I turn it over to you guys and go right ahead. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for pinch hitting, as it were, this evening.
No problem. Basically, I'll start off. As the memo says, and it's kind of interesting, you just had the Board of Ed report, they were giving back to the town $347,000. That's kind of prevalent here with respect to the one-pager that I put together to kind of
Can we do that one after? Let's go,
reconcile.
yeah, let's go to this one first.
Linda's.
Linda's.
You want to go to the detail first rather than the...
Yeah,
Oh, they can't hear you, Bob.
Pull the mic closer.
yeah, closer to the microphone, and let's go to the highlights, because that's what we're used to doing first, and then we'll go back to the roll forward, if you don't mind.
Not a problem?
Thank you, sir.
The highlights reflect the Munis reports as of 7/20, but we will be receiving invoices and paying on them for the next couple of weeks. So this report only reflects a snapshot in time, and it is not final.
Okay.
And so I did my best to show you where the expectations were, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Can we go through the revenue first? Can you just do a little bit as to why we're over in certain areas and why we're under? Give a little bit more of the color, if you wouldn't mind.
And in revenue, over's bad. Over's good, right?
Yeah.
Over's bad.
No, over's always good in revenue.
Okay. Get confused trying to look at these.
You want us just to ask questions, Tom? Why don't we?
Do you rather just us ask questions?
I would.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult with Mr. Hiller not here tonight, right? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what the specific question is regarding what's in front of you. The current year levy is basically, people have paid $385,000 more than we budgeted. Our collection rate is 98.8. So we have a collection rate that is greater than what was anticipated.
Well, that's what I was asking. First of all, they can't hear you in the back, so please speak into the mic.
I don't know what I'm doing incorrectly.
Maybe it's not on. Can you
Dr.
tap it?
Title, sabotage this machine. There's a green light here, but it's not as good as
You can use some of his excess money to fix it, Bob.
My light's not as green as Linda's.
All right, there you go.
How's that? Is that
Better.
Okay. It's all Dr. Title's fault.
I'm used to it.
Okay. basically, what was our estimated collection rate? Do we remember what our budgeted collection rate was for 2012?
I'd have to either look to the budget book or divide and multiply.
So, and then I'd like to know what did we put in the 2013 budget? I think. Yeah, I don't remember. And I want to see where it comes in versus where we are.
You know, the one reason, you know, it's hard to quantify these things because you don't really have any idea who's going to pay your taxes when and where.
Understood.
Obviously, you know, the economy is improving. You know, Fairfield's unemployment rate is, you know, is down.
It actually, I
You know-
just read something that said it went up over the last couple of months, but,
A couple of months is,
yeah,
Yeah.
Fairfield, I thought the town of went up too.
it's at 7.7%.
Yeah, up from like 7.2 or something.
The, as everyone in this room knows, I think, you know, that the town has scheduled a tax sale, and people have then that way identified X number of properties where there were taxes due either for long-term or high amounts. You know, many of the people on that tax sale list have paid their taxes. Some of that is current levy taxes, some of that is prior levy taxes, prior year levy taxes. There's no real way of knowing if we didn't have the tax sale, would they have paid their taxes or not anyway? But it was a way of encouraging people to do so. So that might be, you know, the impact of that scheduled tax sale, which is taking place actually at Ludlow High School day after tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you want to attend. Might have some impact on that.
So, to be clear, Mr. DeWitt just looked it up for us. The collection rate for this year is 98.8 versus,
No, this was for the.
right, and for the
11,
budget,
12 budget year,
it was 98.86.
86. Yeah, as of May 11th, setting, May of 2011, setting the mill rate and collection rate.
Okay, so it's actually the collection rate isn't higher. It's about spot on.
Yeah, it's actually a little lower unless
lower.
somebody did take it out to that second
Right.
decimal place, right?
budget for
98, this,
coming year?
We typically get a sheet that breaks out the current year levy and breaks it out between motor vehicles
98,
and homes, et cetera. I don't know that I saw that this time.
28.80 this year. We actually lowered the collection rate by 6 100.
Right, so for 2013, we're on target.
Yeah.
For 2012, we're
behind
light,
0.06.
but yet we're over by 385, so it'd be interesting to hear what happened there. And I know you might not have the answers
We'll
now.
bring back the detail
Yeah.
next time, or would you like to have it in an email? Your choice.
Let's talk, let's continue through and we'll see, you know, how long it takes and stuff like that.
Because this is vehicle,
Right.
you know, there's a multiplicity of taxes,
we-
tax types in here.
Yeah, we usually get a schedule that breaks that out, and then you can look at it and see. So, okay. Next question, does anybody want to go through building permit revenue? Are we missing some large building permits that were anticipated? We go through this every year.
Yes, after speaking with the building official, he said there really is no major building project on the horizon at this point. So this is the actual revenue recognized, and we shouldn't anticipate anything else beyond
Did
this.
we, for fiscal year 2012, had we in the original budget estimated several large projects to come to fruition?
Yeah,
that-
Sacred Heart.
Yes.
You're talking
Yeah.
about the 2011, 2012.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, there were
because,
some large ones that I remembered in this budget discussion this year saying, well, we can't bank on the fact that Sacred Heart, did they not hit? Was
I'm-
St. Pius, Sacred Heart, I can't remember.
St. Pius is doing work, I saw that the
Yeah.
other day.
Behind
Mr.
Bed Bath and
Tetra?
Beyond.
I don't know what the assumptions were though, frankly.
Yeah, if I might just add in, the building permit revenue has been projected to be down for the last two reports to this board in the quarterly
Yeah.
meeting. So this number is no surprise. I think we've been estimated down 4.5. This might be a little more because the trend
Right.
continued. We didn't see the bump up that we were kind of hoping for in the spring building season, if you will.
Right.
But definitely, one of the impacts is some of the larger projects that had been projected as part of that. And again, offhand, I don't remember the details because I was not on this board at that time.
Right.
But we took pains to make sure that our estimates going into fiscal 13 were conservative in that regard.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. We do remember that the number was supposed to be down. I just didn't remember it being down this much, to your point. It seems to
I
have
think we were projecting,
escalated.
I'm going to say it was over 4, about 4.5 is what I remember from earlier quarterly reviews.
Yeah. Okay. Please, Mr. Brown.
Question on the building permit original budget. Did they break it down in any way, percentage-wise, between what they're expecting between commercial and residential?
I think that's been an ongoing discussion, I think, at each of the last 3 or 4 budget sessions. Basically, there's a base that's brought in, and then Mr. Gillerin will identify some of the top projects that he sees coming through that will have an impact on that. So exactly as you're suggesting, no, it's not broken down that way.
But there's probably a history or an expectation of commercial versus residential. There's got to be a history by this point. I just wonder if it's semi-consistent going back 5, 10 years. And then which is down? Is it the commercial or is it the residential? Or which is down more, or, or does it matter?
Yeah, the residential obviously is typically smaller dollars per permit. When you look at the commercial size, that's where the big dollars come through. When Fairfield U or Sacred Heart were on their building benches, we saw a lot that go through that. You can also see that we can be doing a lot of building permit work, let's say for Fairfield Public Schools, that are not revenue generating. So we can be spending time, effort, and issuing permits, but it doesn't translate into revenue dollars.
And you're right, we've been talking about this for a couple of years. You've brought it up a couple of times when you were on the Board of Finance.
Yes.
And I wonder if it's a number worth knowing, or if it doesn't matter, on what the percentage is, or what we're expecting year over year.
I think we can
between
go-
commercial and residential.
I think we can go back, and I believe we may be able to get a handle on that. As I remember from kind of prior budget sessions, we never had that breakout available to us during the budget process.
Yeah.
So I don't believe that necessarily went into the budget numbers, other than indirectly, because Mr. Gillerin had some major influence to what those numbers were.
Right.
But we might be able to go back and pull that out of history and get a little bit better look at what that is and what's been driving. Certainly, it's been a roller coaster last 3, 4, 5 years for both the commercial sector and residential sector.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on this item? Last on revenue, then. Interest on investment income is over by $215,000. And this was an area we've always been, quote-unquote, concerned about. We put a task force together on cash management that I think we're going to have some discussion about that later on. Not tonight, but I mean, in the future again. How much of the interest on investment income here, or interest on investment, is the mark-to-market at the end of the year versus actual cash interest? Do we know?
I think it's about 300,000.
Okay. And we haven't, that's an unrealized gain, right, Bob? Because we haven't sold the, right.
That's correct, sir.
Thanks. All right, so 300,000. So in fact, if we didn't do the mark-to-market of the securities at year-end on June 26th or June 30th, we would actually have under-delivered on our investment income by about $85,000. Right. And we didn't realize the 300,000 because we didn't sell the investments as of that date for that fair market value.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. Questions, comments? Mr. Brown?
Last one on the school building grant revenue, 126, it just states 126 on the budget, but will improve. So that's just a little vague.
What happened, we were expecting the 126 from the state. Approximately 91,000 of that is an audit at the state level, so
So we're not sure about the 126, we
We're
just
not-
know it's going to improve from where it
we
is now.
know it's going to improve.
Okay.
We think it'll approach the 126.
That 126 actually is a receivable that was booked at the end of last year. So the town, in fact, I was looking at that today, actually, because the town actually received exactly what it thought it should receive for this year's activity. But the 126 is a carryover. Last year, apparently, someone in the town talked to the state and was informed that the 126 wasn't paid on time last year because of some staffing problems. But apparently, there's been no follow-up on that for a year. And, so it's the same 126 that wasn't received last year, that based upon that telephone conversation was booked as a receivable at the end of last year.
So how does that make it under budget this year?
Because it was booked as a receivable, so the budget is this year's activity plus, because we're a cash basis, because we're a town.
Okay. Any other questions on revenue? Fair to say on revenue, this number probably only goes up from here if it goes up, right? I mean, if there's an adjustment to it, it's going up.
Yeah, one of the comments, both accounts payable and current year levy taxes are held open through August 31st. So both revenue will go up and expenses will go up.
Now, for the AP, is that just for invoices for goods and services delivered before June 30th?
That is a correct statement.
Okay. And for current levy, it's just for cash received that relates to the prior year?
Correct statement.
And it
What would be-
technically,
What would be in this year's, this year being the year ended
right,
June 30, 2012, tax grand list year, which is
Is that
actually
just
the
past-
2010 grand list.
is that just past practice? Because that doesn't sound technically appropriate unless it's just been a grandfathered practice for 12 months of activity.
That is past practice, which I have recently become aware of, yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions, comments? All right. Let's go to general fund expenditures. People want to go through the written items here?
Back to Ms. Linda.
Legal services, the 283. Is the vast majority of that related to assessment appeals?
Cohen and Wolf, yes,
How much of that, do we know, of the 283?
to date. And there might be a little dribble of a bill come in, 207.
270 of the 283.
207.
207. What else what's the additional 80 if we just,
I did a legal all-spend for you,
you did?
yes,
Great.
so I'll pass that out.
Thank you, Linda.
Charge it into the slot.
And Mr. Tetro, before you jump up and say it, I know it's been over for quite a while, so. This isn't new information that we're over in legal spending. Thanks.
It's actually over exactly the amount of the RTM cut.
By the way, it's $300,000 in mark-to-market on the interest. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so there is some train station legal expense that's run through here?
That's not in the general fund. The first page is general fund.
Got it.
The second page are other funds, denoted by their org numbers. That's why bond counsel is not in the general fund. Neither is the train station or the workers' comp.
McCarter and English, aren't they related to the train station as well?
Yes.
Okay, so they are in the general fund, though.
They're in the general fund separately for, I
Yeah.
believe, yes, you'll see them in two places,
Right, but,
charged appropriately.
okay, but
for the
they,
work.
they worked on the train station in the general fund as well, right? Is McCarter, Mr. Tetro, just remind me, I know we went through this one before. McCarter and English, they had expenses in the general fund and expenses at the train station. What was the general fund one? I can't remember.
Simplest way to visualize it is we had two different attorneys from McCarter English. Attorney Fisher worked on the contract interpretation and as part of the presentation of this board and the
Yep.
RTM and going for the additional funding necessary. That, his fees were charged to the train station project. Attorney Vitarelli, in looking at our review process, as a general process review, was charged to legal fees.
Okay, so between that and the assessment items caused the overage.
And I believe you'll see some in there for union contracts and
You look at-
Yeah.
broken up by the
Negotiation.
page two.
Yeah, but that, I know, that
That's not the
goes,
total,
that's
though.
not the
That's not
general
the-
fund.
right,
Right.
exactly.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions on legal fund, legal? All right. Heart and hypertension, we've spoken about that ad nauseum previously. We've appropriately budgeted for that for 2013, as far as we know?
This is the number that's off of the general ledger.
Yeah,
I have not looked at the reserve. I did adjust the reserve. I didn't, the town adjusted the reserve when I looked at it in April, but I have not looked at it for year end.
okay. I just want to make sure, our biggest item with, I think, both that and unemployment comp is really making sure that we adjusted it appropriately moving forward, because we knew we've had some softness there previously, right?
Yes, we did.
Okay, any other questions on those two items? Seeing none, police comp, remind us what's going on in that account? This is unique for them to be over.
This is the compensation. This is vacancies offset by their overtime account to backfill for those vacancies.
Okay.
However, if you look at the complete police budget,
Right,
they have conserved in other areas so that their total budget is only over by about $5,000. So they did make up that difference in other items, various items.
okay, but what was the reason they went over budget in the overtime?
They had vacancies, and when you backfill the vacancies at time and a half, it eats up.
Is that, do we know whether that's continuing right now, or has that been largely resolved?
we've made some progress on that, but some of that's continuing.
Some of it's continuing, so are we going to have a budgetary issue in the first part of 2013 related to this?
I don't believe so. I'll go back and confirm that, because I think some of that we can anticipate as we fill those positions and the timing on that. With both police and fire,
Yep.
it's not just a function of getting somebody, it's getting somebody trained and up to speed, and while
You
they're
gotta
in
go through the
training,
academy.
we're still having to replace them in the field, and there's certain functions they can't do on their own until there's, I'm going to call it certified, but on that. So we're trying to get a better handle on mapping out that ramp-up curve, so we can do a better job of managing, projecting the overtime versus that.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra. Any other questions on this?
We're going to have after the overview, can we have an opportunity to?
Yep.
Okay. Then-
Utilities, we discussed that ad nauseum. All other comp is under budget by 840. What is that largely made up of?
That's made up about 610,000 in vacancies, unused vacancies in the regular payroll, and other lines associated with it, overtime, holiday pay, pay diff, that kind of thing, makes up the rest of that, and that's why we termed that compensation.
Okay. Yes, please.
So 840, so that's not, yeah.
That's compensation other than the police and fire we
Right.
directly look at as one of our key accounts.
Right, and I'm going to just ask this question, think about it as I ask it, I apologize. But, so that's not nothing, 840 is a real, a juicy number. So what that leads me to ask is, if it's largely vacancies, are these spots that need to be filled? I mean, are we learning that we don't need this many people? Or maybe not, I don't know the answer, but I'm just wondering, that's not, a small number, it's a good number.
I'll go back to one of your favorite departments, the library. We basically decided back in November that we were going to run at whatever the run rate was at that point. We weren't going to fill any vacant positions at that point, based on what our first quarter returns had been, which had us running in the red at that point. Now, that was prior to refunding and prior to realizing some other expense savings in the spring. So that from a vacancy, there was that vacancy piece. We had some other surprises. When Tom Brown retired as assessor, we moved Don Ross in that position. We achieved some savings in that, and we also achieved some savings in Don Ross's replacement, which we fill with a part-time person through the balance of the year. We then also had someone leave in purchasing. It went 6 months before we could find somebody to fill that. That wasn't intentional as much as it was the skill set wasn't, that we were looking for, wasn't perfectly out there in the market. So there are a number of those things that we took advantage of, as well as certain of the DPW vacancies that we've run without on that side. So we've tried to be very judicious in terms of not replacing anybody until we had to or needed to, from that standpoint.
So can I interpret that as, I guess what I'm trying to get at is how much of that savings here can be pushed forward? It sounds like not much of it. That's what it sounds like.
There is some of that moving forward. Certainly, let's take, there's 2 or 3 positions in DPW that we still haven't filled. So to that degree, some of those positions are moving forward. As you remember from the budget presentations, pretty much every department that came here, police, fire, we had a good discussion on the building department, planning and zoning, were all down bodies,
All down what?
all down positions.
Right.
So we've tried to keep, been very judicious in terms of when we bring new people on. And there is some impact to that, but
Mr. Tetra? Yeah, if you remember from some of the earlier reports to this committee, there were 11 departments that represented vacancy savings potential. Of those 11 departments, 8 of them have filled the positions.
Have filled.
But if I may make a point, on the fire and police vacancies, that is offset with overtime.
These
Your savings are offset, so that 800.
These dollars exclude fire and police.
Yeah, they're-
The 840 excludes
Really?
fire and police.
Well, that's why I asked, yeah.
Right.
All other compensation.
Excludes fire and police, Linda.
Because if
Linda
you look
mentioned that.
above there, you'll see the fire compensation, the police compensation. That's why it's other compensation.
Right.
So how can police be over compensated when they're short so many people?
Because you're paying overtime
Filled.
to fulfill those vacancies. You're also paying for people to be in the academy. Right. Okay. And the debt is the refinancing, and that's the savings for that, the one-time
Yes,
item,
debt will
1.3.
ultimately end up at $1,066,000 better than budget. Munis, right now on your report, is reporting that $1,227,000, but that will change when we pay the June bill for the Clean Water Fund.
By the way, that's a comma in there, not a dollar.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's not $1,000, I wish.
Thank you.
Okay. And all other expenditures are currently $2 million under, but do not reflect the encumbrances. Okay. Do you want to go to the specific reports, and then we can come back to Mr. Mayor's roll forward? Does anybody have questions, comments on the specific reports that weren't? Yeah, Mr. DeWitt.
Thank you. Every year we get that report, thank you very much. But it always looks at the bottom line, the roll-up, right? And every year, I look at the individual lines, and wonder, just like we were wondering with the Board of Ed, whoa, did we give you too much money? You're just returning money we should have never given you? And I have that thought every time with fire and police. So, fire department, I'm kind of happy to see they did exactly what they said. We didn't overrun OT vacancies, by, a gazillion dollars. There's a big injury relief line in here. But the fire department looks like it's leveling off to where they had so many vacancies, just like the budget discussion. Really sounds good. But I was really taken aback by the police department, that 172% of overtime replace. And it makes me wonder, when they roll up to 100%, are we budgeting for a lot of stuff every year just for management and reserve? Are things like these sacrificial printing and binding and laundry and stuff like that, which we spend 30, 40%? Is this just, again, management and reserve because we know we're going to overrun somewhere else?
I think in order to give credit to the managers, when they know that they are operating with a vacancy that may cost them time and a half to replace a vacancy, as well as straight time when someone is in the academy, they make a concerted effort and probably, I don't want to say cut services, but they cut their internal use of other expense lines in order to try to compensate for that. And I think that's what you're seeing in the case of the police department.
I mean, the process is simply what you'd see in the private sector. All right? We expect every department manager to run within their budget. If they're running over, our first turn is to them and say, solve your problem. We don't sit back and say, oh, yeah, you're running over, it's okay. No, solve your problem. Fix it within your budget. Set your priorities, make sure you come in with that. So that's exactly what, literally you do in the private sector. It's what we're doing here. That's what our instructions are to the managers. Fix it. We're not going to sit here and come in at the end of the year and say, hey, you're over. We start this early in the year. For the first time, going through this year, we've started to look at year-end projections every month. All right, so we're trying to highlight what the areas are, not only where we stand for the year, but do we think we're going to fix that or not? If not, we're sitting down with the department heads and saying, we need your help in terms of looking at this.
Can I follow up on that?
Please.
Yeah, I understand that, and that's the valid explanation for a department that's got a small issue,
Right.
right? When you look at, what's the police's total departmental spend?
14.7.
Okay, so it's 14.5 million, 14.7 million. And how much of that is payroll related? Isn't something like $10 million of that payroll related?
Just payroll, part-time,
Anything
Eight.
related to payroll?
8, 9 million.
Right, so it's, I think when you add it all in, it's closer to 10. when you
overtime,
do-
yeah.
Yeah, you gotta add it
9
all
million,
up.
right?
So that means that you are actually able to save. Now, Linda, to what you said before, the police department went over by $270,000, give or take, in payroll costs.
Yes.
So on the $10 million line item, they went over 270. On the $4 million line item, they were able to save $250,000. And this is what was
It's the same.
presented to us as a very tight, lean budget. So the question is, how are you able to save, it was 50 grand, 30 grand, 20 grand, I get it. But $250,000 on 4 million is a pretty large percentage to say I was able to cut that back.
Some of the other accounts that they saved on, about 100,000, are part-time accounts, special police. There are other payroll accounts that are not necessarily specifically related to the police officers. So they did cut back in other personnel areas.
Right.
They didn't save it all on the backs of the business lines.
But if I might, to just that point, what you saw in the budget book this year was a longer track of actuals as we're going in. We're trying to put more focus on the actuals and the trends. Mr. DeWitt, to get to just your point, is Is this something we can push off for years? It's something we don't need as part of our trend line. And we started that analysis in much more detail
But you're
this
trending
year.
the bottom line. You're trending the big number. You're not trending,
No, actually, when we go through as we started with the budget process this year, we looked at the trends, the actuals for each of the lines to see whether those were needed or not, what they were spent on, what they weren't spent on, and what got pushed off.
Oh, you got it
As
right
we
here, sure.
continue to do that, our department heads are looking at it differently than they have in the past. It's not just this year's budget versus last year. It's looking at it with what's the trend in actuals, why did that go up, why did that go down, and is that expected to continue or not? So I think to your point, that's exactly where we're trying to get to, is doing a better job of cleaning up some of the budgetary items that create some excess in that. To balance that out, though, just so we're all clear, if we're going to strip some of those, you don't want to budget every line item for the 100-year storm. You want to budget for reasonable weather. But if you're going to do that, you have to pocket some larger contingency component someplace else, because otherwise you leave everybody on the hook. So as we're trying to build up the overall contingency, we'll be able to go back and make each of these budgets tighter. My caution is that's a trend process, if you will, where we'll get there, and we've started that process this year.
To this specific one, and just given, Mrs. Gardner, what you said, can we just ask Chief McNamara to briefly address what he had to do to make a $250,000 change? Because it's just, I agree with what Mr. Tetro said. It's just $250,000 on $4 million is a heck of a lot of money. And
yeah.
I just want to know if that impacted, safety services, what was impacted, what didn't get done because that money wasn't spent.
And we never, if this were the fire department, I'd be like, okay. But, because we've traditionally seen that in the fire, those large swings. The police department, we haven't seen that. But it's still, like I said, I understand the bottom line, and I understand how, the outside world works and the total budget. But I got to tell you, I know in my group, we hold a salary line, and you don't get to take money out of education because you want to hire another guy, or you don't get more money in education because you fired a guy. That's, and those are big, big drivers. I mean, we're looking at big swings on the big line items. I mean, listen, the $100 here and $1,000 there, I mean, I get it. But, yeah, I'm with you. I'm curious what had to happen to make that roll out.
Any other questions? Mr. Brown?
Are we going over this mayor report? Is that what
Absolutely.
Okay, then I'll wait to that.
Well, we're going over it now. I mean, ask your questions on it, as opposed to, yeah.
The question then
Sorry about
is
that.
on page 3 of this report. On page 3 of this report, under the Internal Service Fund and workman's comp, the workman's comp claims. Am I reading this right, that for fiscal year 2010, 2011, we spent $506,000 in workman's comp claims?
I'm going to check that, because as we collapse the columns, we may have picked up the wrong information, and I will correct that if that's incorrect, because that does not look right.
No, that doesn't look right. Okay. And just looking at this fiscal year, we put,
Wait a second. Workers' comp is a combination of paid claims and change in accrual. Okay? We made an accrual adjustment in April. The accounts were under accrued. Because you have a tail there that goes out 20, 30 years. So you have people where you're actually writing checks to, then you have, the liability of those people for some of them for 20 years. When we evaluated the reserve in April for the March close, we determined that there was an under accrual, so there was an increase in the accrual. So it's just like health insurance and anything else. So I'm not saying that the number is wrong, I'm just saying, though, it could well be correct.
Well, I don't think it's $2 million off.
Yeah.
I mean, I know what you said, but I know we're looking at 2.5 versus 500,000 last year, and I think the line for last year got truncated, or there's something wrong.
It definitely did. It
That's
definitely
what
I thought
Jim
you were
was
talking
saying.
about this year.
No,
It
Jim was talking
definitely
about
did.
last year.
No, it definitely did, and I'll send you out that correction tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. And just again, while workman's comp is on the table, we do plan to work with PMA. We have $20,000 in the budget, I believe, to do so, to address the workman's comp issue, just to talk, when we met with them in November, I think it was November, December of 2011.
We met with PMA in April.
I was talking about our board, but you met with them in April?
We met with them in
Okay.
April. We, as in myself, Mr. Tetro, and Mary Carol, Mary Lise. And we developed a 5-point action plan to try to reduce the ongoing workers' comp claims and costs. That action plan includes better safety instruction, managed care on the health care claims, better management of the indemnity side of the claim operation. And I don't remember the other two offhand.
Okay, so, and now what?
Well, those action plans would be implemented and hopefully reduce the trend in workers' comp claims growth.
If I might, we've actually had 4 or 5 meetings with PMA since the meeting at the Board of Finance level to make sure that we're doing everything we could. It's also been, I want to make sure that we're clear that this has been a joint problem or issue with both the Board of Ed and the town, and Board of Ed management, central office, has been fully involved in the meetings and taking place. Currently, there's an assessment going on by the PMA folks in terms of, at both the Board of Ed and the town, looking for where risk is and what we can do in terms of addressing that. And then some of the action items coming up, that'll come out of that, like the additional training, where do we spend that, who do we spend it with, what do we spend it on, will be decided at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? I want to, if I can, I want to stay on the internal service fund. I just want to, Linda, I don't know if you're the appropriate person to answer this, so I'll start there. If I were to look at the internal service fund and the actual versus the budget for both, I'm combining the internal service fund expenditures and OPEB, and I have a differential, or what I would call a good guy, of about $3 million. Now, am I to assume that the actual amounts in there are not complete at this point, though? Is there?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we attempted to start off this conversation with my one-pager. All of this
Oh,
would
you
have been
attempted.
explained. Excuse me, I attempted. Yeah, these accruals, I mean,
So just,
accruals, the answer is the accruals, the accounts have not been evaluated, accruals have not been adjusted.
right, that's all I needed. So on the internal service fund, unfortunately, we don't have a $3 million good guy because there's more to come in, right? Which is totally separate from the surplus and totally separate from the general fund. And totally separate from this, from that perspective, right? So it's not part of the one-pager. Okay. All right. Any other questions on the detailed reports? Mr. DeWitt continues to flip. Mrs. Leclerc, do you have anything?
Ready to hear his.
All right, so let's go to your surplus, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for this. I appreciate the roll forward. We appreciate the roll forward.
It's not exactly a closing document, but given the attention that the board pays on the Munis product, basically, what we did was just put together a quick list to explain that the $3.6 million savings is not, or surplus is not necessarily real. We did some work looking at specific accounts that would appear, this is broad-based work, that there's going to be, $850,000 in additional payables, accruals there. Encumbrances at that time was $500,000. They're probably, this is, changes, I think those are like 400,000 now, or
497.
497, so only changed 3,000. Other accounts payable and other accruals, the union contracts that were settled have not been taken to the contingency account, and some of the contracts have not been settled. So those will have to be accrued and carried forward to next year. And there's other things in there also. And as an indication how things change, on July 20th, when the Board of Ed was called, they were still telling us it was $200,000. And as we all learned tonight, it's $347,000.
No, they reported back in June that it was 350.
Yeah.
It
It's
was,
been a while.
it was reported to the Board of Ed and in the press that it was 350.
To the board.
Yeah,
Well-
it was quite some time ago.
There was a phone call made, I didn't make it, and it came back at 200, so,
Yeah.
but anyway. So that's basically, not.
Okay, so the additional estimated expenditures, the encumbrances in the AP, how do we compare that to what was outstanding at the same time prior year? Because you've got like $2 million here that we're saying.
Yeah, I
is-
mean, this is all very broad brush done in the last couple of days. And, it might be appropriate to, I mean, given that the books and records stay open until the end of August, given that accruals are not evaluated until the end in early August, it might be appropriate to have this session at year-end close in August as opposed to the
You
middle
mean
of
in
July.
September, right? Because
Well,
it's,
September would be really, yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm saying at least August.
yeah. Any questions, comments on this? I'll just tell you, I did, since I don't see any of my colleagues, I'll give them a minute. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation here based on the details that were provided. And thank you, and Mrs. Gardner, thank you for the detailed reports that we go through every quarter. It's a vast improvement over, years past, so I appreciate that very much. But if I do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, I have the increase here being closer to 2.3 to 2.5 million, as opposed to the 1.5. And the way I did that, very simply, was if I took the debt at $1,067,000, if I took the other comp and said essentially that other comp is, payroll's kind of locked down. I know we've got the contingency thing, we'll leave that to the side. But if I take the comp, that's a saving of 800,000, round number. If I take the utilities, I know you have June bills at 200,000, so I take of the 493, I take 300,000. And then if I take the 350, which is a good number, it's 347, I'm rounding. 350 from the Board of Education. And I add up the 350 or so, the 300 in utilities, the 800 in comp, and the 1.060, I'm going to say, in debt. I've got 2.4 million in savings. That is virtually locked, because it's comp, which should be done, it's debt, it's utilities, and it's Board of Ed. That's 2.4 that gets put off to the side. And then there's still all other expenditures here, like $2 million. That's for everything else. Does that sound right?
You might well be right. There's other sides of that equation, however. There are the accruals. I mean, for example, if I understand correctly, and Linda would know better than I think we're looking, there's a private school bus transportation bill that is what size?
That will leave us with an additional 100,000, 358,000.
$350,000. That's not, so there's one item that's $400,000 that hasn't been recorded.
What do you mean? I don't understand that.
Actually, that might be a little confusing. Private school bus transportation, actually, we're anticipating a surplus of 100,000 at the end of the year.
Okay,
And right now, Munis is reflecting almost a $500,000 surplus, so that's
Okay.
going to decrease by 400,000.
right, and that's why, but that's not going to affect utilities, debt, right? In other words, you've got $2 million of other stuff that's underreported out there. Can't affect utilities, can't affect debt, can't affect comp, can't affect Board of Ed. If I just add those four up and say everything else, you move all around all you want, those numbers are essentially locked. They're known, and it's 2.4 million.
To be continued.
All right. Well, what's going to be interesting, what I think is going to be important for the discussion in September on this, is to see how much of that is one-time items versus, much like we did with the Board of Ed tonight, how much of that is one-time versus how much is recurring versus how much is controllable versus how much is uncontrollable, I think is going to be the question. But, I mean, on the face of it, I'd say as opposed to 1.5, it looks 2.3 to 2.5, all other things being equal. Otherwise, you're going to be transferring money out of those accounts in September because of over expenditures in other accounts.
Right.
Yeah, do you guys, does that make sense? I mean,
I know where you're going.
yeah. Does that
You
make
just
sense?
did this math.
Yeah, so that's how I put it together. I don't know, because I was just trying to get back to the 1.5, that's all. So,
Well, 1.5 is actually 1.
Right.
It's 7.5 now, actually.
because of the Board of Ed, because of the Board of Ed, right,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
1.69.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's 1.7
It's just not 2.5.
versus
2.3.
2.5 is what I'm
Yeah.
saying, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, cool.
And I'm not, please understand, I'm not saying that your numbers are not correct, or, I'm just saying there's a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm not comfortable saying
Right,
yea
right.
or nay.
No, I'm not trying to put any words in anybody's mouth. I just wanted to, when I looked at it and did my own review, that's how I came up with it, and I just wanted to see if I was off base somewhere, so. Does anybody have anything else? All right, let's, thank you, Mrs. Gardner, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Tetra, thank you. Mr. Mayor, I think you're staying, right?
I do have that pleasure, yes, sir.
All right. We're to hear a brief presentation on GASB 67 and 68, and thank you for putting this together in a pinch for us.
There are two very small typos in your document, so I killed a few trees to give you a fully, hopefully typo-free doc.
That's okay. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you very much.
I think they're already in here.
Do you want to come sit on this side?
Is it?
You got remorse here?
They're already in here.
Typos, that's what I said.
Yeah, there's a couple typos. They're replacement
Oh.
pages.
So he wasn't killing about killing or kidding about killing.
A couple of introductory remarks. One, the statements are not published yet. They will not be available till August. So this was done without complete access to the statements. However, there are documents out there that GASB has presented, and I would like to quote from one of their documents. It is important to note that the new statements relate to accounting and financial reporting issues only. How pension costs and obligations are measured and reported in audited external financial reports. The statements do not address how governments approach pension plan funding. The new guidance establishes a decided shift from the funding-based approach to an accounting-based approach. The board crafted its new statements with the fundamental belief that funding is squarely a policy decision for elected officials to make as part of the government budget approval process.
So basically, they're saying this affects reporting, not funding.
Correct. Okay. With that, statements 67 and 68, replacing statements 26, 27, and 50. Summary. No change in funding requirements, and we'll talk about that. Net pension liability, a new term. The next pension liability now goes on the balance sheet of the financial statements. It's no longer carried in the footnotes of the financial statements. And it has a very specific definition as to how it will be calculated. It is accrued liability using entry age normal costs, not the other, there's like 6 cost methodologies, I think you're all aware. This requires entry age normal costs less market value
Of the assets.
of the assets.
Yep.
Mark to market, no smoothing, no amortization, mark to market that year. That becomes the liability. It's effective for town reporting, June 30th, 2015. It's effective for the trust, i.e. the pension plan reporting, June 30, 2014. The town reporting has been beefed up. A lot of the trust reporting is now replicated in town reporting because GASB has made the statement they believe people who read the town and/or government reports, the entity reports, are interested in what's behind it, the numbers as well. Funding policy. There's a new actuarially calculated, this is a new term, actuarially calculated employer contribution. It's a new term, and it must be funded, it must be calculated by the sponsors. Now, obviously, the ARC, everything is calculated by the sponsors. The reason I point that out is because the expense, which we'll go into, the expense calculation, because the mark-to-market is very volatile, and you don't know the numbers of the mark-to-market till after year end.
Right.
And so to be input in the budgeting, to include it in the budgeting process, it's really not possible to use the expense. So basically, you're going to be calculating 2 items here. It's 2 separate calculations is what I was trying to point out here. You have your expense, which will go into the financial statements, and you're going to have your funding, which will be prepared prior to that, and will be a separate calculation.
So the funding is the actual cash, the expense is the actual cash, and the mark-to-market impact.
And,
Yeah, I mean,
okay, yeah.
yeah, the calculation, right.
Right. The annual expense, because the mark-to-market, as I said, is
Volatile.
it's volatile, not a good candidate. The ARC, we all know the ARC, right, is currently the most prevalent funding calculation method, and is their belief, and the literature's belief, that the current ARC calculation will likely be the default policy for the ACEC calculation. But they are open to other reasonable funding policies. Okay. Net pension liability, this is interesting. It's the actual, the net pension obligation, the old term, the current methodology, is the accumulation of pension ARCs less what the actual contributions have been. And I think that's since 1987. So whatever happened prior to 87 is not reflected on people's financial statements or in their footnotes. Your current liability is just the difference between the ARC calculation less what you have contributed 1987 to date. The new pension liability, very clear. It's your accrued liability, entry age normal costs, less the market share of your assets. This is, the old term ARC, normal costs plus amortization of unfunded liability. This is the expense. And it was expense and funding. It is now probably funding only. It is definitely not expense. The annual expense is the entry age normal cost method required. It's basically the calculation is your service costs using entry age EAN normal cost, plus your interest costs, minus your expected return on assets, plus or minus immediate change, immediate recognition of plan changes, plus or minus your amortization of assumption changes and actuarial experience gains and losses. The assumption changes would be like your plan changes, like you have to use a certain retirement table or a different mortality table or salary assumption changes. Any changes there, the immediate impact goes into the calculation, okay? What then, though, gets amortized is the amortization
Those
of
assumption
differences between those assumptions and your actual experience.
Okay.
And whereas in the past, on the asset side, so you got 2 sides on the actual experience. You got the asset side and the liability side. The asset side being the assets, basically, right? That's mark to market. amortized over 5 years. Okay. Difference between your expected return, i.e. your 7.5, and your actual return, your 0.62. I did that for Ken. And then on your liability side, you know, you have what your actual mortality is, what your assumed mortality is, your actual termination experience, your actual turnover experience, your actual salary scale experience. Those are amortized over the expected future working life of the current, expected working lifetime of the current employee population. Generally, it's a number that's in the 10 to 15-year range, versus currently that's amortized over 30 years. And generally, and which I did not say earlier, on the asset side, that, as I said, is going to be 5 years. Generally, people are doing that over 20 years. So the expense calculation, and then, so as you can see, because the liability requires mark-to-market, and this allows some amortization, so there will be deferred credit or debit
Right.
on the balance sheet as well.
Right. Right.
So the summary slide is the same as the first slide. No change in funding requirements, big number on the balance sheet, not for us, but for many people.
This might be a premature question, but do we know, first of all, is this only pension? Does this impact, is this going to impact the OPEB at all?
Well, I started to do another slide, which is going to be, if I was doing this on the wall and you weren't going to see
Yeah.
it earlier, it would have been preview of coming attractions, and it would
Right.
have said OPEB.
Okay, so that's coming next.
It's coming. When next is,
Right.
but yeah, it's clear.
And I know, first of all, and I want to thank Mrs. Leclerc. She brought this actually to the board's attention with an article that she picked up in a trade publication, forwarded, circulated amongst our boards, and we actually went to Mr. Hiller. I went to Mr. Hill on our behalf and asked him to get some information and get this on the docket for the meeting, knowing that it was very preliminary. So I thank you for stepping into the breach, Mr. Mayor, on helping put this together. Quick question. Have we had any indication from the rating agencies, and some of this is reporting requirements, better disclosure, believe it or not, I actually understood it a little bit, and it's better disclosure
Thank
of
you.
numbers. Is the, have the rating agencies said anything about how they're going to factor this information in, or how they're going to?
Well, you know, that's a very interesting question. I have not talked to the rating agencies or read anything specifically that
Yeah.
they've stated, but it's a very, because, like, if you look at the town of Fairfield got put on credit watch.
Right.
Because we were $4 million off on our internal service fund, right?
This
We had
is
a
gonna be
change of 4
millions.
years. And where we had an almost fully, I don't know, we might even be currently fully funded. I know it goes up and down. We're kind of, we're straddling that fully funded line over time. We're not-
Right.
Yeah. You know, whereas other people who might be 20, 30, $40 billion underfunded, but they're okay on their internal service funds. So, yeah, this is, because this is basically going to reduce your fund balance.
Change the face of your balance sheet.
Yeah,
I mean, it's-
totally.
Yeah, and I'm not so much concerned for us on the pension side, like you said, we're fully funded. On the OPEB side, we're not. So that's going to hit us on the OPEB side, and we're going to be one of those that has this large unfunded liability out there.
Because of the newness of OPEB, which is interesting because I'm actually talking about this tonight, because when I first joined the board, I remember bringing up the concept of OPEB, and people basically said, not in our lifetime.
Right.
And I do think because of
lived
the new-
longer than they thought.
I lived longer. Basically, I personally think it will take a while,
Right,
because it's a lot newer. It took a long time for pensions to get here.
right.
So I'm not looking for it in the next couple of years, for sure. Probably not the next 5.
It's going to be interesting. We've got to pay attention to. Does anybody have any other questions on that? No. Mr. Mayor, thank you. Mrs. Leclerc, thank you for bringing that to our attention a few weeks back
You're welcome.
on that. So, hearing no other questions, we have 2 very brief committee reports. I want to go to Mr. DeWitt first. You've been meeting, I know, in earnest with your private agencies committee. So if you could please just briefly tell us where that stands and next steps.
Sure. 2 of my fellow committee members are here, Selectman McCarthy Vahey in the back, and of course, Mr. Brockfeld. We've been meeting just about every other week, trying to keep a pretty regular tack to keep the committee going. We've gone through some mechanical workings of our charter, which we've resolved, thank you very much, which we'll discuss Thursday evening. So our charter's been locked down. The Board of Selectmen's actually going to review our charter at their next meeting, just to make sure we're all aligned, so we get through that.
Once that's done, can you just flip that to us? So that
Oh,
we-
absolutely.
Thank you.
No, absolutely, and just for public disclosure, our charter, all our meetings, agenda, everything is on the website under not-for-profit committees, under agendas and minutes, so everything is there. The meeting minutes are fairly detailed, so we keep everyone up to date, because I know a lot of people can't make the individual meetings. What we're really focusing now on is again, the mechanics of the process. We've started to limit, I don't want to, we haven't decided on anything yet, but a couple concepts of who will actually administer the not-for-profits going forward. I think it's pretty well agreed upon by the board that having all the entities come to the Board of Finance and the RTM is probably a little bit of overkill, and that we can consolidate that. But our discussions are now around eligibility, how we're going to track eligibility, and again, how we're going to go and formulate a process to the reporting agencies for us, which will be the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the RTM.
Any other questions, comments?
I don't know if anyone would like to, Mr.
Anybody?
Brockfeld or Selectman McCarthy-Vehy?
Timeline.
Yeah. We set a timeline of complete closure, which I hope we're going to beat handily, of October 1st. So October 1st, we will be complete, come hell or high water. And again, hopefully a lot sooner. Because again, we are meeting pretty regularly. So, you know, we're not letting 2-3 weeks go ahead of time. It's every other week, which gives us enough time for us to have communication with outside entities and other municipalities, and just kind of catch up on the homework that we usually end up leaving each committee meeting with. So,
Great. Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Seeing nothing else, we'll go over to Mr. Brown to hear a report and an update on the Budget Project Process Review Commission. A sexy title that is for.
Sexy time.
For a sexy guy.
Right.
This
That
is
was
live
him.
TV.
Go ahead,
that was a
Mr.
little uncomfortable.
So our committee met, let's get rolling here, right? Met on June 14th. And just as a reminder, I'll just review real quick who's on the committee, which is Mr. Tetro, Dr. Title, Mr. Phil Dwyer from the Board of Ed, 2 members of the RTM, Dave Becker, and Mr. Hal Schwartz, and then a member of the TFC, Al Kelly. So we met on June 14th, and our primary point of discussion was the proposed timing for the review and approval of non-recurring projects. And what we decided to do was to take this proposed timing back to our respective boards and get a sense of the body, which the RTM already did, and I'll get to that in a minute. So this board's been talking about this for years now. But our committee's in agreement that if we take these non-recurring projects and we move them back in the process, it will make the operating budget procedure much more smoother, and it also gives these non-recurring projects their due time that they need. So the proposed time would be for the Board of Ed to get their presentation in September and vote on in October. For the Board of Selectmen, they would receive their presentation in December, and they would vote in January. The Board of Finance would receive their presentation in January and vote in February. And then the RTM would get their presentation in January as well and vote in February. So this will be complete before we get into the operating budget. The RTM, they had a sensitive body. From what I see from their minutes, they voted in favor of this overwhelmingly. And I'd like to get a sense of this body so we could take it back to the committee and move this along.
Okay, does anybody have any comments on this right now? Mr. Brockfeld? You guys? Okay. Do we want to take a sense of the body vote or wait till our September meeting when we've got better attendance? This is the first I'm hearing of it, so I haven't had the opportunity to think of it.
Okay.
So would we be holding anything up if we waited till September?
I think September will be fine.
Okay, so why don't we do that in September?
Okay?
Okay, anything else to report?
No?
Okay.
I mean, we'll be meeting again, Mr.
Mr.
Tetra?
Tetra?
Just to kind of paint the picture, this has been well received by the other two boards. I think that we're starting to move in this direction, setting it up so we can do things in this timeline. I think the Board of Ed is currently projecting to have fewer non-recurring type projects come through this year, so that makes it an easy transition from their standpoint. I think we've got a few on the town side, but it should be a relatively easy transition for us, too. So it's not like we're all preparing big books of
Right.
of 20 or 30 projects. I think it's 2 or 3 on each side.
Great. Are you guys discussing the bigger projects as well, and how they should be put together, and whether they should be done at a one-time as opposed to a one-off? I mean, is that discussion ongoing?
That discussion will be, once we focused on these non-recurring.
Okay,
Okay, but we did, and it's in the minutes, that we do recognize the fact that we need to talk about these larger projects. The idea was to get through this and
Yeah.
then move on to the larger.
yeah, because I think the larger, what we were doing, I don't remember, was last year or a couple of years ago, it seemed like every month we were hit with one project right after the other, and actually, it felt like that happened right after we completed the operating budget. And I remember people getting really tired of the fact, and there was a lot of, oh, if I had known that,
Right.
discussions that I think we want
That's
to
absolutely
avoid.
true.
I think there are a number of things that have been in place since then. Your work in putting together the waterfall gave us a better financial plan.
Right.
The Board of Ed, I think, has updated their long-range plan a couple different times and done some to tweak that, but also to keep everybody aware of it.
Right.
And I think on the town side, we've done a more formal facilities plan to kind of help update those projects. So I think everybody's trying to give us a lot more visibility, and as you've seen, in some cases, we've even gone to the level of having presentations well in advance of a project coming through for funding, so everybody had a long-term heads-up on that.
Okay, great. Well, so we'll take this up at our September meeting when I can properly notice it, and we make sure that we get the other guys here.
Sounds good.
Great. Anything else from anybody? Mr. Tetra, while you're at the chair, any new business for this board?
Not at this time.
Great. Seeing none, any comments, questions from the public? The first time tonight. Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. I have one by Mr. DeWitt. Do I have a second? Mr. Brockfeld. All in favor? Those opposed? Abstentions? We're done for the evening. Thank you, everybody.